Chris Mackowski exploring the road from Civil War to civil rights. And it's a real treat today to be talking with park guide Ranger Rebecca Hoffman from Arkansas and Little Rock. And you can see the high school behind her. Rebecca, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
So obviously, Brown versus a Board of Education is this huge milestone that really kind of sparks the modern civil rights movement. Give us a quick overview of the implications of Brown v. Board.
Well, of course, Brown is known as, May 17th, 1954, the Supreme Court unanimously rules segregation is unconstitutional, citing the Equal Clause Amendment of the 14th Amendment, which is, of course, one of the most significant amendments in the post-Civil War period. And then what you start to see happening is throughout the country is that some parts of the nation immediately moved to deal with this. In fact, one of the lesser known facts about integration that kind of gets lost amongst the stories of people like the Little Rock Nine and Ruby Bridges is Charleston, Arkansas is actually going to integrate in the fall of 1954. But because there's no drama, no real major news headlines with it, you never really hear about it. Their story gets lost. And so we start, when we look at the civil rights movement, we're kind of already on this crash course, if you will, with the civil rights movement from the minute the military is desegregated in 48, and then on to Brown. And then Brown kind of amps up the stakes, if you will. It starts raising racial tensions and ultimately leading to things like Emmett Till in 1955. And as more nations and more states rather start grappling with that. And in fact, Little Rock will very quickly after Brown start being like, okay, well, how do we respond to this? What do we do? They do make, I'll give them credit in this case, they do make moves pretty quickly to start planning for a gradual integration plan here in Little Rock in the fall of 57.
And that was one of the things that the Supreme Court said when they issued Brown was that we know this is going to take some time. This is going to take some adjustment. We want to provide that time before places have the opportunity to integrate. And so, as you say, Little Rock starts that process of integration, but there must have been some resistance to that process on a bunch of different levels, I would suspect.
Yeah, so, it's really interesting when you ask certain people who kind of grew up in that time period, you'll hear this narrative very often especially from white individuals who lived in Little Rock, is that they were very surprised by the backlash because Little Rock was considered progressive. Well, progressive in that sense for 1957 anyway, and it is progressive when you compare to other Southern states. Arkansas is the only state in the South that does not mandate segregation in neighborhoods. They actually integrated public transit in 1956 following Montgomery. They saw what was happening there and they're like, oh, we don't want to get involved in that kind of thing. But even though I think a lot of these Southern white individuals in Little Rock get lulled into this false sense of progressiveness and whatnot, U.S. members of the Little Rock Nine, and they'll still say, well, yeah, sure, but at the end of the day, we still couldn't go certain places and we still couldn't do certain things. And for, Terrence Roberts, for example, it made no sense to him to have to go to Horace Mann as the new black high school, because he actually had to walk to the bus stop at Central to get the bus to Horace Mann. So you see situations like that as well. And then what really happens, what really makes things bad is that when the governor gets involved, Orville Faubus is kind of this weird dude because up until 1957, he is seen as a very moderate, safe choice. He is supported by both Black and white constituents. But it's all a political game, right? And so ultimately what has to be taken into consideration is that Arkansas had no term limits on their governor terms at the time. And he wants to be one of the first governors, if not the first governor, to have a third term. And in fact, he goes on to be the longest serving governor in Arkansas history. He served 6 consecutive terms. During the Little Rock crisis, he's only in his 2nd term. And so he had previously supported Brown, had said he would have, been one of the judges. If he'd been a judge, he would have agreed in that segregation was unconstitutional. But now in 1957, he gets on television and he says, oh, well, there's mobs of violence, and they're coming to the city and blood will run in the streets of Little Rock if a Negro enters Central High School. That's what Faubus says. And everything he says is a lie. He's trying to rile people up and scare people. And so what you also see is on the morning of September 4th, when the 10 children, because it's 10, first start coming to Central, reporter said, local said they saw a lot of out of town plates, not out of town of Arkansas, but a lot of people from around the state and also nearby states like Mississippi and Georgia, not Georgia, but Mississippi and Louisiana. That's not to say there weren't people in Little Rock staunchly opposed to integration. They were, and there's a whole list of those folks who make their feelings very well known. But Faubus is successful in really riling up people around the state, and then they kind of descend on the city in mass and blow this up into such a huge issue, if you will.
So he turns it into something that might not have been anything.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we don't know what might have happened, but if he had just not sent the military in to violate federal law, who knows what might have happened,
Orville Faubus, and I have to admit, it's one of the few names I remember from high school history class, along with Estes Kefauver, just because they were crazy names. No wonder the guy turned out to be crazy. Orville Faubus. Imagine growing up with that name, right?
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned there are actually 10 kids. We famously know of the Little Rock Nine, but there are 10 students that show up. Tell us what happens when kids come to school on that day.
So it's kind of a mixed bag of interactions, if you will. So by the time you get to September 3rd, which is the first day of school in 57, there are 10 children who have said, yes, we are going to go to Central High School tomorrow, which would be September 4th. They were supposed to come on the 3rd. The school board says don't come because of what Faubus had said the night before. So originally the plan had been they were supposed to meet up together down in between 13th and 14th Street. All together and then walk. They were going to be escorted by community leaders, meaning ministers, 5 Black ministers and 2 white ministers. But somehow along a breakdown in communication happens. Now there's different reports and different stories based off who you ask. According to Daisy Bates's memoir, that night before they were supposed to go to school, she thinks to herself, I don't want the kids to ever I don't want them to arrive early and run the risk that they are alone. They should all arrive with adults with them because their parents had been told not to bring their kids to school, hence why they wanted the ministers there. So Daisy said she started making phone calls after midnight, Daisy being their mentor with the NAACP, to meet at her house. But then she realizes, wait, one of the kids, Elizabeth Eckford, doesn't have a phone. So she says, she kind of grappled with what to do. Well, I could go to her house. Well, it's midnight. They've already been threatened. So, she could be greeted with a gun at the door if she shows up at their house. She knows Elizabeth's father works overnight, but she doesn't necessarily want to go looking for Oscar Eckford in the middle of the night because she's already had threats made on her life and he works on the rail yards and may not be safe. So she says that she planned to go to Elizabeth's house the next morning and tell her in person, but she forgets about Elizabeth. Missing from that narrative, though, is why Terrence Roberts, another one of the 9, never got a phone call. And to this day, from what he has said in interviews, he doesn't know why he was never contacted. So you have the photos eventually of, 7 of the children arriving. Melba Patillo is not seen in any of the photos on September 4th because according to her memoir, she and her mother did arrive together and they were chased away, so they had to leave. But the most, of course, famous photos from that morning are going to be the pictures of Elizabeth Eckford, 15 years old, walking that kind of gauntlet of hate down Park Street. She makes 3 integrate this or to enter the school. The first 2 attempts, the guards just kind of gestured to her to move along. You can't be here. So she keeps going. Eventually, at the 3rd attempt, a guard says he is under orders of the governor not to allow her kind into the building. At that point, all of these protesters who have been out here since before the sun came up descend en masse on this little girl and they surround her. And now she is trapped. She can't go back the way she came. So she has to just continue walking down to 16th Street where there's a bus bench, continuously being harassed. At some point, someone begins to spit on her. She said that she heard a man say, let's get a rope and tie her up from this tree, all these awful, horrible things. And then she goes to wait for the bus and the bus takes 38 minutes to come get her. And then you see some reporters trying to protect her. Benjamin Fine with the New York Times attempts to comfort her. Daisy's husband gets to her at some point. She doesn't want to leave with him because she doesn't know him very well. She's a 15-year-old girl. He's a 47-year-old man, those kinds of things. Terrence Roberts did say that he was told by reporters, because at this point he's come this way from the school. So everyone else is down at the other end of the school. He's told by a reporter Elizabeth is over at the bus bench. He goes to her, says, come on, Liz, let's go home. But they live in opposite directions of each other. So she thinks, well, how am I going to get home if I leave with you? So she still wants to just wait for the bus. And then eventually when the bus finally comes, a white woman named Grace Lorch will get on the bus with Liz, and they leave together to kind of make sure that Liz is safe, so to say. Liz will go the rest of the way. Actually, instead of going straight home, she goes to the deaf and blind school for Negro children where her mom works, because after all that, all she wants is her mom. You have the photos of the other 7 children. At some point, we do see Terrence kind of catches up with the kids, and they kind of are confronted by the guard, but because they are this larger group of people and they have adults with them, they are relatively unscathed. And then they will soon leave after that, and that afternoon be investigated or interviewed rather by the FBI downtown at the federal building.
First of all, I just gotta say your storytelling powers are wow.
Thank
Holy
you.
Wow. And you think these grown adults behaving in such barbaric fashion toward a kid.
Yeah.
Just mind-boggling. One thing that you said in the midst of all that is you use the present tense verb as you were talking about some of the kids and their recollections, and he still thinks this, or like some of this history is still with us today.
Yeah.
Tell us about that, how that history is still here.
Well, for me, with my own background and the sites that I've worked at, this is the first historical site that I've worked at where the people involved in the story are still alive. And that is very humbling. It's a very, it's like when I was at Appomattox, it's not like I call up, Bobby Lee and ask him a question, right? But here, I've had Minnie Jean Brown, for example, I had a question about something she said in an interview in like 2002. I contacted her daughter, and then her daughter is like, let me ask my mom. And next thing I know, I get this message, here's my mom's phone number. She said you can call her. And then when I had a 30-minute conversation with her, the entire time I must have been shaking, because I'm like, I've been doing this for 2 years, but it doesn't get old, because these people are such icons. They're American treasures as far as I'm concerned. And so, even when I picked up Elizabeth last week, I said, yeah, I have your phone number in my phone. I'm like, I have 2 Little Rock 9 phone numbers in my phone. I was like, that's too much responsibility that I can just call these people up and ask them how they're feeling and what they feel about this. And then to have things that I kind of have been saying on my tour, people always look at the photos of Elizabeth walking down Park Street and saying how calm she looks. And I tell people, I'm like, I don't see a calm little girl. I see someone who is retreated into herself. She is stoic because she doesn't want to betray her emotions. And I asked Liz about that, and she said that's exactly what it was. She said, I had retreated into myself. And to just have that kind of resource and that validation just means the world as a historical interpreter, that know, okay, I'm really getting this right. And that's so important, especially when talking about Black history.
And one of the other resources you have as well is the school itself. Tell us a little bit about what it's like to work at this iconic site.
So it's a very unique experience. Of course, Little Rock Central High School is still an active public high school. It is the only active high school in the country that is also a National Historic Site. So I remember my very first day driving to work, and I was sitting in the school traffic, and I just kind of was looking around at all these kids, and I'm seeing children from all walks of life, white, Black, Asian, Muslim, and all these things. And I'm thinking to myself, that was a really cool moment, because I knew that they were able to be there because of the Little Rock 9. All of that being said, it's not without its challenges. Of course, people always come and they say, oh, can we go inside the school? And I'm like, well, you can't. And then I have to explain it. And of course, before COVID, we were actually allowed to take people inside the school on tours, which was really cool, and to kind of point things out and go into the auditorium. But now for the safety of the children, that's really, really been curtailed, which I understand. But then having to explain that to the average visitor who doesn't realize it's still an active school. And sometimes we will get phone calls saying, a visitor walked inside the school today. And I'm like, well, that lends its own confusion, because people think, oh, is the visitor center inside the school itself, which it's not. We're across the street. So it's a very unique experience, and you hope when you see these kids that they understand and appreciate the power that they walk in. I think some of them do. I worry that not all of them do, but that's probably true in general for the public school system, unfortunately.
Right, right. In some regards, it's almost like we can take those sorts of things for granted because of what happened. I mean,
Mhm.
it's unfortunate when people do take those things for granted, but in some ways, it's kind of a gift that people can, because someone once upon a time had to walk in footsteps down that sidewalk that were much more tumultuous and much more dangerous.
Mhm.
Yeah. So as you get to kind of be in the space, how does that help you better understand the story, to be in the space and being in contact with these folks?
Um, I think, I think a lot of it is it inspires me to just constantly be learning, especially when you put in context of what the nine went through into what is happening in the world today. It puts me in a constant state of trying to be self-aware. Sometimes visitors will say things to me, and I say this as a white person in this space. Sometimes white visitors will say things to me that I don't think they would ever say to my Black colleagues. And what I mean by that is I think they maybe feel safer saying from a white person to a white person. And so they'll say things to me like, oh, one time I went into a bar and I was dating this Black guy, and they didn't want me there because I was white. I was being discriminated against. And I'm always like, okay, well, hold up, back up. So now I have all this context, this historical context running through my head. I said, okay, well, why do you think they felt unsafe around you? Because historically, some Black communities have not felt safe around white people. And it always kind of boggles my mind a little bit when they try to share stories of being discriminated against, and then they'll compare themselves to Little Rock Nine, and I'm like, okay. I think that because I'm around these folks so much, I'm even more protective of the story, and so I get very, very defensive anytime someone tries to, I think, compare themselves to Little Rock Nine. I'm like, there's nothing that you could have ever gone through in your life, that could compare to what these people went through. I tell people on my tours, I work for the Little Rock Nine. Yes, the government pays my checks, but writes my checks, but I work for them. And so being always self-aware of that. And then even though they're scattered, right? We only have 2 of the 9 living here in Little Rock. Their family and friends are here, right? Minnie Jean's sister Phyllis still lives in Little Rock. She will post on our park's Facebook page all the time. And so you never know who you're going to interact with. But on the same side of that, there's also people who come into our site who haven't changed in 65 years. And that also can be a challenge to make sure you check yourself and your emotions when they are kind of being frustrating to interact with.
Yeah. Talking about how, you're a steward of this story and that you work for the Little Rock Nine. And I think that's a wonderful perspective, because it is a story that in some ways belongs to all of us, but someone really needs to be protecting that story and watching its integrity and making sure that it's carried on in the right way. So now, you did not originally think you were going to end up in Little Rock. You told me prior to the interview that you wanted to be a Civil War historian, and
Yeah.
you have literally walked that path from Civil War to civil rights, or at least metaphorically walked that path. Tell me a little bit about how you got from point A to point B.
So I grew up actually in the National Park Service. My dad is a park ranger, and even though he himself has never worked at a Civil War site, he works for Sandy Hook with Gateway National Recreation Unit. Growing up, he was always taking us to Gettysburg and Civil War battlefields, and we would go traipsing in the woods to the Garrett farm where John Wilkes Booth was captured. And so because I grew up in Lynchburg, Virginia, I had all of that history always around me, and growing up calling Appomattox the surrender grounds. I started interning at Appomattox in 2015 when I was like, I think I want to be a park ranger. And so that was an amazing time to come into it because it's a sesquicentennial. So I got to, in fact, my professors let me take like all off of class and work to be able to attend all 5 days of the 150 at Appomattox, which was just an amazing experience. And the whole theme of the sesquicentennial of the war was Civil War to civil rights. So I was at Appomattox for 2 years, kind of developing and honing my skills as an interpreter, started doing living history. And then I started working seasonally at Vicksburg. And I think around that time, I started going through a personal shift. Personally, I was raised very deeply entrenched in lost cause mythology.
You're from the
For
hometown of Jubal Early, for crying out
right.
loud,
I mean,
right?
my mother jokes they almost named my brother Kevin Jubal Early. Okay, so this is the kind of environment I was raised in. In fact, Arlington House meant so much to my mother that that's where my father proposed to my mom. So it's in my blood, growing up with pictures of Lee and Jackson and revering and idolizing them. And so then 2017 happens, and I moved to Vicksburg. I went to Vicksburg for my first season as a park ranger. And 2017 is, of course, when what happened at Charlottesville happened. And that really kind of, to reference an old commercial, was like the V8 slap up the side of the head, when you're like, people are willing to kill over these beliefs. And so I started really self-assessing and reanalyzing the things that I was believing and intaking, and then learning more about the incredible Black history at Vicksburg with Milliken's Bend and the U.S. the early, before there's the U.S. colored troops, the Black soldiers at Vicksburg who kind of helped pave the way for the USCT. And that was so special to me, especially when I could connect with people of color who came to Vicksburg, because we don't get a lot of non-white individuals in places like Vicksburg. So if I saw Black families coming in, I wanted to make sure that they could find themselves in the story. So I'd like, go see the Black History Monument in Vicksburg, the Black Soldiers Monument. It's the coolest monument. Look about all this cool story. And so that kind of started putting me in the headspace. I think it'd be really cool to work at a civil rights site, and to kind of to develop my skills better as an interpreter. And when I talk about how do we get the civil rights movement out of the Civil War, and how is the Civil War still impacting us to this very day, and how they're two married ideas. And so I applied to so many different places, Tuskegee and Selma, and I couldn't even get an email back. And I was just like, okay. And then the summer of 2019, I went to Fort McHenry, because I was like, okay, I got to get away from Civil War for a little while. I don't want people to think I can only do Civil War. Which even then at Fort McHenry, I was like, hey, let's talk about the Civil War. I couldn't help myself. But then that summer, I decided to go back to grad school and get my master's. And it was a little clandestine, because the same week that I was accepted into the program, the job at Central was posted, and it was a pathways position. So it was only for students.
Wow.
And so it all kind of worked out. And it happened that my chief here at Central, who's now at Pearl Harbor, but he had worked with my chief at Vicksburg. They were like best friends. So it all was like one of those perfect stars aligning at the right time, right moment, to get me to where I believe I'm meant to be.
Wow. That's a fantastic evolution, a fantastic personal story. Absolutely love it. So if people come to Central, what do you hope they get out of that experience?
My hope is that people will come to the site and they will take away the idea that regardless of who you are, whether you are white, Black, Asian, Latino, how old you are, if you are 14 years old or 80, if you're raised by a single mom or not, whatever your condition in life is, the status that society uses to demonize us from one another, I want you to realize that you can accomplish anything, because the Little Rock Nine, they didn't go to Central to change the world. They went to Central because they wanted an education. They wanted that better opportunity for themselves. They wanted a better opportunity for their parents, because they knew it'd be cheaper to send them to Central rather than getting on the bus to go to Horace Mann. And along the way, they changed the world, and they were just kids. And you look at kind of the trajectory of their life since then, and now even at 80 years old, they are still fighting back against the system. They are still trying to make this world a better place for future generations. And so I think that's what the Little Rock Nine represent, is that you can do anything regardless of how old or how young you are, or what your condition in life is. And don't ever let someone tell you you can't do something, because the whole world was against the Nine in 1957, and they still managed to make the world a little bit of a better place.
There is nothing I can say to top that. That was fantastic. Well, I'm speechless. Thank you very much. Absolutely wonderful. I think that the site is lucky to have you there. What an inspiring, energetic steward of that story you are. Thank you so much for
Thank
spending
you.
time with us. So is there anything I haven't that I didn't ask you that I should have?
I don't think so. Just, I'd say this: when you go to any national park, make the visitor center your first stop. That we have a great exhibit space that will kind of help set up the whole story. And then, you don't know what you don't know. And if you don't come and talk to us, well, you might miss some really interesting facts and tidbits and things. And you might be like, well, what's the deal with that old gas station that's across the street? But if you don't come and talk to us, you're never going to learn about this old 1950s gas station and its role in the story, or the weird looking bus bench that's down on 16th Street that's also related to the story. So
very good. Folks can find you guys on the web where?
nps.gov/CHSC. And I am the social media manager for the park. So we do have a very active Facebook page. So please go find us on Facebook at Central High NPS, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you can't make it to our site, all of our exhibit content is also on our YouTube page. So oral history interviews, the videos, everything's on there as well.
Wow, fantastic. Rebecca Hoffman, thanks so much for spending some time with us today. It's really, really been a treat. Thank you.
Thank you very much.